so much history and science behind what this might be.
It's kind of moving around a little.
And parts from me were found and thrown in with my son.
Calling boo hags the most dreaded creature in South Carolina folklore.
Is it supposed to be enclosure? I don't know.
These spirits are drawn to this beautiful blue, and they get trapped inside, and when the sun comes up, the bad spirit, the haint, will be destroyed.
And they appear to be moving extremely slowly.
Again, this has been reported for generations.
Am I really seeing this? What is this?
Before Clara Barton, I used to perform as other Moxie women. For example, Rosie the Riveter. I performed as Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind, and several other. But I was the writer, I was the producer, and I was the actor. That took an awful lot of work. When I finally landed on Clara, I decided to stay with her. Clara lived for 90 years. She was born on Christmas Day in 1821, and she died on Good Friday in April of 1912. And those 90 years, she has such a large life. She's like a diamond. There's so many facets to what she did that I can talk about any different point that I feel like. It's very interesting to talk about Clara because she was a teacher. She was working with the patent office, with the government. She was a humanitarian. She was angel of the battlefield, where she went to take care of all of the soldiers after the battle. She founded the American Red Cross. So there's just such an expansive amount of life that she lived. What I like to talk about her on Hilton Head is because that most famous woman in America came to Hilton Head twice in her 90 years. The first time was in 1863. Right in the middle of the Civil War. She was here for 9 months, and the purpose of her being here is not as important as what happened to her from a transformation. It was here on Hilton Head was the first time that she had ever worked with a large number of the former slaves, or freedmen as they were called, who were living at Mitchellville. It was in working with these people that she realized the importance of education and the importance of universal suffrage. For her, if they did not have the right to vote after the war, then the whole war would have been for nothing. Suffrage was essential. It was the essence of that war. So when I do my performances, I like to say that she came through that transformation here on the beaches of Hilton Head. She actually met another woman who was an early advocate, an early feminist, an early abolitionist named Frances Gage. And Frances is the one who helped to enlighten Clara's thinking, in addition to working with the freedmen who lived at Mitchellville. One interesting and unknown piece of information about Clara is that she suffered with depression her entire life. Her mother was a depressive. The autobiography accounts for unusual behavior on her mother's part. Well, Clara exhibited and carried much of that forward in her life too. But Clara, the way she dealt with depression was to act, was to give, was to be a humanitarian. But she didn't find that out until she was 40 years old. So those first 40 years of Clara's life parts were happy, but parts were unhappy because she did not have a purpose. She wanted to be a teacher. She had ambition, but at the time people were not allowing women to work. And if they did, they would pay them a minimal sum. She was not willing to work for those less than what men would be paying for. By 1860, she was in Washington, where she had been for 6 years, and she met a lot of the power brokers in Washington. She knew generals, she knew senators, she knew congressmen, she knew all these people who helped who help her get a job with the patent office, which she worked with. She was the first woman to ever work at a patent office. She still wasn't that happy with it. It wasn't until the Civil War began that Clara found her purpose, because it was the Civil War that ignited that latent humanitarian impulse that was in her. And that's when she went out and started taking care of soldiers after the battle. The people wonder, how did she get Angel of the Battlefield? This took place in Virginia, and there was a particular doctor at a field hospital. His name was James Dunn. They had no water, no supplies, no cots, no medical supplies. And at midnight one evening, Clara arrives on her 4-horse carriage, and she is full of medical supplies and bandages and beds. The doctor said, "Oh my goodness, if ever there was a heaven, you would be an angel because your arrival was so timely." So that's how she got the name Angel of the Battlefield, and that was how she was known pretty much for the rest of her life, that and the founding of the Red Cross. There were many other angels, I would like to say. There were many other women who did the very same thing that Clara did, but she is the one that we remember. She is the one who was able to gain attention, perhaps, and to gain notoriety. She came to Fort Mitchel, we can assume. Clara was primarily down at Fort Walker on the south end of the island. She was at Mitchellville. She had a little house that was 60 feet from the beach. It was right on the beach, and that's where she stayed. That's where she helped with the freedmen. She went to Beaufort a good bit with her friend Frances Gage, because there was a hospital in Beaufort that she worked at. But I can assume that she came here to visit at Fort Mitchel, because she writes about riding horseback on the beach for miles and miles, and picking strawberries and blueberries and blackberries on these big vines, and making turtle soup, and just enjoying themselves, because there was really no fighting here on Hilton Head, because the Union Army had invaded and established Fort Walker here, or the Department of the South here. So most of the activity here was pleasurable, let's say. It was a nice place to be if you didn't want to be in a war. There were hotels, there were restaurants, there were saloons. It was plenty of food. She was a humanitarian, though, and was not happy about all of the luxury that was here. And she has written much about how guilty she felt, knowing that her boys back in Virginia were eating hardtack and stale crackers. And here down in Hilton Head, she was eating off of linen tablecloths and fine dining. I don't have any particular connection with Clara until I came here, and I was a tour guide, and I have done a lot of tours. But over time, I got tired of saying the same kind of tours, and then I decided, well, let me tell stories through the lives of famous women. And like I said, I had performed as Rosie the Riveter, Eliza Lucas Summers, and Margaret Mitchell. But by the time I got to Clara, I thought she is most pertinent to Hilton Head because she's been here twice. And plus, I don't have to learn a new woman every 6 months. I mean, it takes a lot to study, research, to get the accurate, and then to be able to talk about it and to deliver it and to practice it. So I stayed with Clara for that reason, and because it does fit in with the Heritage Library, who owns Fort Mitchel. So that's why I stay with Clara. And but I was also thinking, when I was growing up, I wanted to be famous. That was all I wanted to do, was to be famous. And I remember living in St. Simon's Island. I would have that Spanish moss wrapped around me, thinking I was Marilyn Monroe. And I never got famous, obviously. But Clara Barton was the most famous woman in the 19th century. So in a way, I got to be a little famous. I get a little feel of what that is like. The second time here was in 1893, when she came as, when she came as the president of the Red Cross. And she was 72 years old when she stepped off the train and saw the devastation of that Class 3 hurricane. According to her records, to her diaries, there were 20,000, 30,000 refugees, people without clothes, without food, babies with no parents, crying, not being able to find where they belonged. Dead bodies were all over the place, people as well as animals. People had become so accustomed to the death to the corpses that they just stepped over to get around. She said in her 72 years she had never seen anything quite like this. Giant trees were wrenched out of the ground. There were no buildings. So she and Dr. Johnson and the Red Cross volunteers set to work. Within 9 months, the Red Cross had first cleaned up all the debris. They had built homes for all the people in the Sea Islands who were most affected. All the gardens were growing and producing potatoes and corn and lettuce and whatever else they were growing. In addition, people were getting healthy again because they had cared for the sick patients. And the total death, we think, is at least 2,000 died the night of the storm. It arrived at midnight on a high tide and a full moon. And no one knew about preparing for storms back then. So all these people who were living in these huts, basically, these rudimentary houses on the Sea Islands, were washed out to sea. And this was the first hurricane that she had ever attended. 5 years later, when she was almost 80, Clara went to Texas after the Galveston hurricane, which killed 5,000 people. She had attended some of the most horrific catastrophes in America at that time. She was in Cuba and was helping in the insurrection there until the Spanish-American War started. So that makes 3 wars that she was involved with: the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and the Franco-Prussian War in Europe, where she found out about the Red Cross. In 1869, this is 4 years after the war, Clara had been traveling the country talking about the battles that she had been in, the war experiences. She had been pushing for voting rights. She was pushing for abolition and universal suffrage. And after all those 4 years of war, she was exhausted. The doctor sent her to Europe for a much-needed vacation, where she met the founders of the International Red Cross, and then got into another war, the Franco-Prussian War, where she stayed there for several years. She was so impressed with the effectiveness, the cleanliness, the organizational abilities of those Red Cross employees. She was bound and determined that she would bring it back to America. It took 10 years. I like to say that she went through 3 presidents and 6 congressional terms. She lobbied Washington all that time. She had supporters, but finally in 1882, the American Red Cross was established. And from then on, she went on about 15 or 16 catastrophes in America. After she left the Red Cross, or she was removed from the Red Cross, she formed another organization. It was called the National First Aid Society. It eventually was taken over by the Red Cross, and she died about 5 years after she left the Red Cross. She is a phenomenal woman, having accomplished so much in her life. Like I said, that she was depressed much of her life, but her cure for depression was to act. It's not what you want to do, it's not what you feel like doing, it's what needs to be done, and then do it. And that's exactly how she lived.